Thank you so much. And so now we move on to the next vibrant panel discussion. The topic is Managing Privacy Challenges in Cloud Computing, moderated by Ms. Yashu Bansal, Assistant Professor from Manipal Law School, Mr. Vinay Disley, Mr. Krishna Kishore B., and Mr. Rishabh Mehta. May I invite our guests onto the stage? And now it's over to you, Yashu, to take over.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming here, and a big thank you to the panelists for agreeing to participate. The pattern will be a brief introduction, 3 questions, and then we'll open for questions from the audience. So first of all, I'd like to say that it's an absolute honor for me to moderate this because we are all here. We also understand the issue with bridging the gap between tech and legal. So I'm a lawyer, and I'm sitting here with 3 people who hold great expertise when it comes to security, privacy, and the technical controls for the same. So I think quickly we'll introduce ourselves. And I'm a lawyer. I work with Manipal Law School, assistant professor. Before here, I've worked as a lawyer, in-house, consultant. I have startups and businesses with their privacy requirements. I have also worked in Europe, in Rotterdam specifically, where we built a privacy pipeline for customers there. I'll quickly share the mic.
Thank you, Yasu ma'am. My name is Rusab. I am working with a company called Rubrik, though I'm not going to be, representing them in my talk. I am working as a GRC specialist, and as a part of my role, one of the focused areas is privacy implementation as well. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Vinay Disley. I have about 3+ decades of experience in cybersecurity, data protection, and privacy. I have had long innings with Wipro first and then with Cognizant, handling these areas specifically for clients as well as internal organizations. Currently, I'm working as an individual advisor for a startup company.
Hi everyone, this is Krishna Kishore. I'm director with KPMG. My role is to help on the transformation of security in the cloud computing as an area.
It's great. As a lawyer, I think there's a disclaimer here. All views expressed are personal opinions only. Very important. And before we start, I was looking for some, some judgments or some case laws in this regard, privacy challenges in cloud computing specifically. I found a lot of breaches, a lot of reports around breach happening due to vulnerabilities in cloud computing. There are issues around liability, who is liable. There are issues around, that what are the role of cloud service providers? Are they supposed to be treated as OTT? Probably. But one very interesting case with 2Rackspace Technology, where they were held liable for a data breach. And it was one of the rare cases where we saw a cloud service provider being held liable. So I understand we have a very technically sound audience, but for my benefit, I'll just simply try to explain what cloud computing is. Please correct me here. What I understand is, as a user, when all my data is stored in a cloud for reasons such as on-demand services, for high quality applications, that's when, and when this data is processed in the cloud, it's as simple as cloud computing. Is that it, right? In simple terms, that is it. But yeah, before we jump to privacy challenges, I found this very interesting 2023 report which said that around 39% of data breach in businesses happened because of vulnerabilities in cloud computing. And around 40% of these data are sensitive information. That requires demand and attention from all of us sitting here as to what are the challenges, how do we solve them, and what's the way forward. So we'll start with Rishabh here. Rishabh, can you talk about one of the challenges you have seen, privacy related, when it comes to cloud computing?
Sure. So first of all, we need to be understanding the, environment when we are trying to leverage the cloud computing technology. So in context of privacy, we need to be understanding the roles of the entities. We have a data fiduciary, which is data controller in case of GDPR, and then the data processors, right? So it's always going to be the shared responsibility, even in the case of privacy as well, between the two. Uh, to give you the example, let's say suppose as a particular ABC company, if I'm using a software called as Workday as my HR management system, then Workday becomes my SaaS provider. Over here, as an ABC company, I become the data fiduciary and the Workday becomes my data processor. Now further, it also includes the supply chain ecosystem. Workday might be, using the infrastructure of any of the public cloud service provider, probably Amazon, AWS, or the Azure or any other. They even become my, the data sub-processors, correct? Now, the thing is, we need to be understanding the nuances around the purposes for which we are processing the data. And for first of all, to understand all of that, we need to be having a data discovery in place. Like what kind of a data it's there which I'm going to be processing, which I'm requiring to be handling as a data fiduciary, ABC company. And with that, I will be, knowing what kind of the data I'm going to be putting it onto the Workday, right? So I need to be having a data flow diagram in place. Once I'm going to be having all of that, we need to understand that no matter what, whichever service deployments we are going to be using, in this case, I'm using the SaaS deployment, right? I'm using Workday as a, like software as a service, correct? Whatever service deployment is, data management is always going to be the responsibility of the cloud consumer. In this case, it is ABC company, the data fiduciary. So they need to be ensuring all the technical and organizational measures that are required to safeguard their data that is going to be put onto the Workday. It could be your identity and access control related to a particular employee's data. It could be, encrypting the sensitive information. It could also be related to any kind of ensuring the availability of a particular data. Now, on the other hand, when we say that it's a shared responsibility, it's the Workday's responsibility to make my instance available up and running all the time. So that's a shared responsibility. Then if Workday is using the infrastructure of public cloud service provider like Amazon, AWS, then fixing the vulnerabilities at an infrastructure level, at a kernel level, and all of those becomes the responsibility of AWS to ensure that they run the vulnerability scans, they perform the penetration testings, so that they have a robust mechanism. The equation how it needs to be managed is, in cases of any kind of the changes, the major changes, whether the consent has been withdrawn for a particular processing, or like my purpose as a legitimate usage has changed as a data fiduciary, then I will be responsible to inform my processors and the sub-processors that these are the changes either happened from my side or from the data principal's side, that they withdraw the consent, so that they go ahead and try updating whatever the mechanics are there around in terms of handling the PII. Other than that, we need to be cognizant about the breach notification. So as a data fiduciary, ABC company is responsible to notify to the data protection board or the supervisory authorities. But then let's say suppose if the breach happened, ma'am explained about Rackspace. So the breach happened at the third party, the processor side. So those cloud service providers or the cloud processors are going to be responsible to, intimate us about a particular breach that is going to be happening at their side. So this is how the ecosystem in a cloud usually, is been dealt with when it comes to the nuances of managing the PII.
Thank you, Rishabh, so much. Vinay, can you also throw some light on one privacy challenge which you think is the most dangerous for everyone?
Yeah, so I'll stick to one because there are just too many out there.
Of
When you talked about cloud computing, you kind of simplified it, right? And that's the biggest challenge today. So when you talk about something in the cloud, can you see it there? You can't, right? There's so many aircrafts going out in the cloud. Can you see it there? No, right? That's how data is. I mean, he talked about multiple partners. When you see cloud computing, you have infra as a service, software as a service, you have so many things as a service. You don't know where the data is. And the biggest risk is, or the challenge is, how cloud computing is being utilized today. Now it is made any organization or any team in the organization to spin off their own application, spin off their own business process in the form of an application and put some data in there. Now, are they being governed? That's the biggest risk. It's very easy, it's made it very easy today for anybody to have any application, any data, anything running anywhere without the slightest knowledge as to saying that how they should be responsible for it. That I see is the biggest risk, and it is also the biggest advantage of cloud computing.
Thanks, Vinay. Last, Krishan, can we get one input from your end?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll probably stick to the issue that I see when organizations operate at scale in cloud. Lack of proper asset management practices. If you don't know what you have, you will not be able to secure it. So I think lack of asset management practices where you have visibility on everything which is around cloud, which is, of course, it is actually, it's not easy. So that's actually one of the issues. Now, because cloud is actually pervasive, global, if a multinational organization is dealing with data of customers across the globe, then how do you handle, let's say, data storage, data access for a specific region's customers, but the data is hosted elsewhere? So I think when an organization is operating at scale in cloud, issues like asset management and having adequate guardrails in cloud computing to ensure you have control across the organization to adhere to the privacy controls is one of the issues.
Thank you so much. I think I imagine that in this panel, I'll also talk a little bit about the laws applicable. I'm a lawyer here, so I cannot but help myself from taking a legal perspective. What I realize is when it comes to cloud computing, and in any jurisdiction, there's no one law. There's a mix of different kinds of ISO standards, a little bit of IT laws, some security practices, but there's no one law which can apply to the entire sector. So I will ask one question to each of our panelists here. First is for you, Rishabh, that we hear the term identity-based access management a lot, like, right? We are also seeing that when it comes to data protection laws recently. But what are your thoughts on how to implement that? Like when you practically want to implement that control, especially from the perspective like how you shared the responsibility of a cloud provider versus a company which is gathering. So how do you fix that challenge of identity-based access management?
Right. So even before jumping directly onto the solutioning of the IAM part, I would like to touch base on a very valid point mentioned by you that there is not a single law across the geographies and the industry. So you all understand there are omnipotent regulations like GDPR or DPDPA, or then there we have the local guidelines and the regulations around country-specific, something like RBI or similar to that. And then we have the sectoral laws like PCI DSS compliances, HIPAA, and all of those, correct? So how we tried, implementing them is basically, we first start off with the omnipotent laws like GDPR. We consider them as the baseline to start off with. And then whatever the, further applicability is there pertaining to any kind of the sectoral laws or the functional laws is what we try incorporating it over and beyond the benchmarking of the omnipotent laws. To give you an example, the challenge in the cloud requirement pertaining to PII is highly about, first is around the data localization. So basically what we try doing is, we try knowing where all my data is going to be flowing from between the cloud service providers and the sub-processors, the processors and the sub-processors. Depending on then, we try to see what my applicability of the laws are going to be looking like. And based on the applicability of the laws, we try incorporating the solutions around it. Like to give you an example, DPDPA has provided significant relaxation on the cross-border data transfers. Because we all understand about very obvious reasons around we are an aspiring economy and all of those things. However, the sectoral law defined by RBI is very stringent in terms of the cross-border data transfer. It demands for data localization. So you need to be having a particular copy of a transaction of a particular data pertaining to RBI gamut within India, correct? So even if DPA allows, I still would want to get it compliant with RBI if it is in my purview. Then the second aspect is around the data retention. Again, like, the omnipotent laws like GDPR, DPDPA, they will not define a particular data retention period. But then if you look, all the sectoral laws, all the functional laws, they will come up with their own guidelines around the data retention period, right? So over there, we will be again going with the most stringent one. The particular law which is going to be asking us to retain a data for the maximum period of time is what we will go ahead with, because that suffices my legitimate purpose of retaining that particular piece of information. Now coming to your question and to answer the IAM portion. IAM portion in cloud is more or less similar to what we have it on the on-premise as well. It is just about, first and foremost, integrating any kind of the cloud services in a more standardized manner. So your Entra ID or any of your particular Auth0 will enable that to, try enabling the standardized approach between any kind of your cloud service that you are trying to use. So what we try doing is, we try first and foremost, if we are having the on-prem AD as well, we try integrating it with that so that we are in sync. We don't have any kind of the issues around the rogue identities and all of those aspects. Other than that, what we try doing is, like, there is something called as the resources management from identity standpoint on the cloud. So whatever resources we are trying to use, be it the services or the work groups or any of those things, we try providing the, role-based access controls and all of that within that. Over and beyond that, it is always going to be the data fiduciary's responsibility to try enabling any kind of the identity and access management controls in terms of like the access provisioning, in terms of like, enabling the multi-factor authentication. If we are trying to leverage the single sign-on, then try to ensure like, all those single sign-ons are adequately been managed and monitored. Then if it is around, the identity and access management is around like, trying to perform the periodic access reviews. When we are trying to share, ultimately we need to be giving some sort of access to our cloud service providers as well. Though they are our data processors and the sub-processors, but there are going to be the times wherein they might require access beyond the metadata in terms of performing either the troubleshooting or even in terms of like, performing any kind of the upgrades or the feature releases from their side to ensure that the testing happens and all of that aspects. So when we are going to provide any of those accesses to our data processors, as a data fiduciary, we need to be understanding how are we governing them. So governance of the identities and the accesses on that is going to be becoming even more critical.
Got it. Thank you so much. You touched upon sectoral regulations, and that is quite an issue for us as well. Vinay, my next question for you is around sectoral. In law, we are still struggling about, it's difficult to be compliant because when your entire business model has to follow different regulations. And as you correctly said, RBI is more strict. Or let's say when ICMR starts managing its database in a very sector-specific manner, it gets challenging. So in your opinion, do you think a sector-based regulation for cloud computing is the way forward, or would you think that there should be an alternate way, something more efficient if this is not?
Okay. So, see, you can't de-link both. Okay. So when you talk about sectoral and talking about particular industry sector, the laws are made out to support or enable the business that the sector is into. Yes. Okay. So if you take HIPAA, for example, HITRUST, for example, they're all, let's say, health care related thing. If you talk about GXP, it talks about health or life sciences, right, in the manufacturing space. You talked about PCI, it's in the financial services. You see, there's a strong linkage to the service model, what they do for a living, or banks, what they do for a living, or healthcare company, what they do for a living, how their activities need to be regulated. So to that extent, there will be nuances that come in. Okay. Now, is there a need to have another law for it or a specific law for it? It's a question of that particular industry, right? And unless that industry is also regulated, I do not see privacy being kind of getting coming in. Like if you take manufacturing, it very loosely regulated. Purely, I mean, if you talk from a privacy perspective, not that found that out, right?
No.
So healthcare came out first, and especially in the US, that's where it started, right? Healthcare industry, they wanted something to do. They have this FDA, whole lot of stuff they have on that. Privacy also, they came out with their own laws, right? But fundamentally, from a solution perspective, for people in the healthcare or in the specific sector, it's not a big issue because their day-to-day, they deal with only their business model. For them, they don't see it different. It becomes a problem for service providers because you have 10 clients in healthcare, you have 10 clients in BFSI, you have 10 clients somewhere else. For us, service providers, it becomes a nuisance, right? How do we do, right? How do we have the best of everything? So therefore, when you talk about sectoral laws, first is from whose point of view are you looking at? If from the enterprise point of view, it's not a challenge for them because it's their own law, right? They are not bothered about PCI. Healthcare license is not bothered about PCIs unless they're having some credit card related stuff. They're largely bothered about HITRA. So that's how I see it. It basically simplifies what the sector needs to do specifically. It kind of eases the situation. Yeah, for some it could be difficult, but for that sector, if you take, it's pretty simple, straightforward. That's where it benefits.
Yes, for regulation-wise also, I mean, it is difficult, but it's better because expertise then trickles down, regulatory-wise thinking, which brings me to my question for you, Krishan, because law is something which is very jurisdiction-specific, but with technology, there's no borders. Now, even when it comes to data protection or AI Act, we are seeing different countries come up with laws, but we have to understand it's not impacting people only in that country. So in your opinion, should we move towards a more global policy or a global set of practices? I understand we have ISO standards, but do you think there should be a more global effort towards making a similar strategy when it comes to privacy challenges in cloud computing?
Yeah, sure. So there are actually two parts of the question. One is borderless cyber. I think I would probably equate it to increasing attacks such as a face for any enterprise. For example, if an organization uses IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, etc. Now, each of these ecosystems may have the third-party applications speaking to them. It may have third-party users speaking to them. Now, each of these may have different ways of SDLC mechanisms. Each of these may have different infra-code kind of mechanisms. So across the board, while each of these are interconnected, it is essentially resulting in borderless things, which I refer to as evolving attack surface. Now, coming back to the second half of the question, where is it possible to have one? I think every geography, every country will have their own perspective, will have their own interests. When Ukraine was attacked massively using cyber tactics by Russia, I think what we read, right? So Ukraine has a specific interest in safeguarding their critical hardware and infrastructure. Now, India's perspectives and interests could be different. So which means it is very difficult to have a globally single policy or standard, but I think in probably my view, globally we can have high-level best practices or guidances in terms of how do we adhere to some of these best practices, number one. Number two, the cloud service providers can probably help support interoperability much more. They can also help document and evangelize mapping of different requirements, different controls across regulations, let's say sectorial regulations or geographic. So I think even after having these two, the individual countries or enterprises should have their own ways to enforce the guidance given.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that answer. And before we move towards our final question, which will be solution-oriented, now that we have discussed challenges, I want to touch upon this aspect of measurement of risks, risk metrics. When I'm looking at law as well, for me to go to a court of law, I need to prove damages. That's a different thing in the law. Like in Europe right now, they're discussing about how to prove that a person felt wronged because of some wrong profiling, user profiling maybe. But before we go to that, it's also important to know how do you put a number on your risk. Let's say when you are assessing a technology or you're doing a risk assessment, What I'm sure you face this challenge as well because it's difficult to quantify. So can you throw some lights, like very shortly, on how do you tackle this challenge of quantifying risks when you're assessing any development or any challenge? We'll take one. Yeah, Vinay can start. You can start, Vinay. It's okay.
See, there's no answer to that, right? Quantification is pretty difficult in terms of be it a security incident or a privacy incident. It's extremely difficult when you want to quantify the business impact of it. Okay, and you want to add a dollar value, it becomes more difficult. Correct. So it again, I would say it goes back to the culture in the enterprise. That's what it kind of boils down to. How are you looking at it as a risk? At what level are you measuring it? Are you measuring it at an operational level, or measuring it at an enterprise level, or are you measuring at a board level? Okay, all those things kind of come into place. Now, what could be highest level at an operational level need not be highest level at the management or CEO level, right? What is highest CEO level may not be highest at the board level. So therefore, it becomes extremely complex when you say about how do I quantify the risk. Okay. So what I have seen in practice is the strategic risks which the board typically would look at, they would go with the high, medium, and low. Unless they want something very specific, they would ask for a dollar number. But what they would be looking at, how they have, have seen people look at it is that if it comes in the newspaper, what is the impact it will have on my reputation? Let's say if a data breach happens and they hit the newspaper, and then what is the reputational damage it have? That is what the board would be more kind of wanting to understand, and they would raise questions from that, and that is where they would say, okay, how big can the impact be? How big, is there a business interruption that you expect, or is it a loss of contract that you expect? So the yardstick would vary. It could be slightly lower at the CEO level and the CXO levels. Operational level, everything is high risk for them, right? Because they are very closer to that thing and stuff like that. So it varies. I have not come across any mathematical model or any model that talks about what is the best way to quantify a risk. That would be my point of view.
Vinay sir rightly mentioned the challenges out there, and it's very true as well. I would like to answer this in a very different way. So first and foremost, we need to understand that privacy risk is slightly different than the information risk. Information risk is more to do from the lens of the organization, whereas the privacy risk is more to do with from the perspective of an individual's own data. So when we say that, as an organization, I would be having my vested interest to safeguard my own data. But when it comes on the other side of ensuring that my privacy is not getting hampered, I'm just trying to ensure someone else's protection of the personal information, right? So it even then becomes much more challenging to ensure the risk, how it can get addressed. So there are two ways to do it. First and foremost, the answer to quantification of risk is very challenging in privacy, to be very honest, to answer it straight away to the point. But then there are ways to counter the privacy risks as well. The first and foremost is try performing your data protection impact assessments, DPIA. If you are going to be having very thorough clarity around what personal information are you collecting and processing, half of your job is done over there. If you are going to be true in your own spirit of handling that particular piece of information. What do I mean by that is, we had the entire conversation on the consent management just prior to that. What I generally recommend or advise the organizations is, rely on consent management to the minimum extent possible. What do I mean by that is, always go by the legitimate interest in the usage as far as you can possibly go to. Only use the consent where it is outside of your primary core activity of processing of PII data. What do I mean by that? Like Zomato, their primary core activity is to deliver a food. Now, if they want to provide the cashback or a reward point, or if they want to send you a birthday cake and needs the date of birth, those are the value-added services. Only for those services or the processing activities, you obtain the consent. Minimize your consent as much as possible. Over there itself, you have reduced your particular risk environment from PII standpoint up to a larger extent. I'm not denying that even in the legitimate usage, you run away from any of your technical and organizational measures, that those are still applicable and those you need to be still going ahead with. But the nuances around the consent withdrawal and all of those things will reduce significantly. That is the first aspect about how we are trying to have your DPIA in place for all your records of processing activities. That is the first aspect. The second aspect is in terms of see, it is very easy to say that, I had a particular information attack or an incident or an event in my organization which led to so-and-so compromisation of my own particular company's data. But when it comes to the individual's data, everyone sees it very differently. So the risk to someone else is different than what the risk a particular individual is or a particular organization is. Within the same industry, a company is going to be risk averse or a company is also going to be risk adverse. So it all depends on the culture, like Vinay sir mentioned. So then the organization has to decide whether we want to drive the privacy program or the initiative which is going to be the compliance driven, meaning because the regulatory requirements are there, that's why we want to do it, or we want to drive it in a more ethical manner in a very true spirit. So whatever approach we take it defines what my risk strategy is going to look like. And then to answer your question around quantification of risks, it's very challenging. It's very challenging when it comes to the PII data because every data field, an individual takes it in a very subjective way, how critical and sensitive it is to them, how sensitive it could be to the other person vis-a-vis. But then when it comes to security risk management, organizations are trying to pull up their legs over there. There are the frameworks like FAIR Institute, Factor Analysis of Information Risk, and those which will define your single loss expectancy, annual risk occurrence, and you then try multiplying that, and then you have an asset value. Asset value, first of all, we don't know what all our assets are in the cloud, like Krishna sir mentioned. How are we going to be defining the value of it? Certain things which we even don't know, tomorrow if, and the tester is going to be opening a particular instance of a VM, which is going to be public facing, and just because it's a test environment, and we wouldn't have applied a significant patch onto it, and if it is like outdated OS or the golden images are not applied, it is inviting to the risk surface, right? It's increasing my attack surface out there. How are we going to be quantifying that? It's very practically very challenging as of date. Industry is trying to find out the solutions around it, and that's where forums like this, when they collaborated with the academia platform, the research goes into it, and then maybe someday we might come up with an answer that can really help us with that.
I'll just add to it. So basically, if you only talk about metrics, for an enterprise to improve their data privacy program, some operational metrics that can help them demonstrate how compliant are they towards regulations or requirements, etc. It could include, let's say, number of data processing agreements that the organization has versus the total number of vendors that the organization has who process personal data. Number of unencrypted data assets versus the total number of data assets that actually store personal data. So many such simple operational metrics can help organizations improve their data privacy program. Now, in addition to it, how can you use the regulations, or let's say, how can you use your compliance to data privacy regulations to enable your business advantage is one more metric I would say. For example, if all the service providers like AWS, let's say Azure, Salesforce, etc., are continuously showcasing how many attestations, how many regulations are they adhering to. Now, if a provider says, I am adhering to 45 out of 50 data privacy regulations across the globe, then it is definitely a business enabler for that OEM or the enterprise. If an enterprise can publish, look at a metric where the number of data subject requests which I was able to process versus the total number of requests that I have received, it again is an absolutely great business enabler for that organization to improve the trust that the end customers have in that organization. So I think you should probably start with simple basic metrics to help your data privacy program.
Yes, thank you so much. I think we have received some very good solutions as well, best practices which has to be done. And I'll quickly wrap up this panel. I'm getting a time's up notification there. I'll just quickly wrap up this panel with some last highlights. What I saw in Europe is that they passed the EU Data Act, and there's a big push to ensure a smooth switch from cloud computing to edge computing. They want to ensure that there's portability when it comes to data. Basically, the goal is to ensure that as a user, I have a multiple vendor option. And also, I see that Europe is building something by the name of EU Federated Cloud, which is by Germany and France. So there are trends of development happening here as well. And I think this was a very interesting session where we discussed some challenges, how it's not possible to come to some solutions, and with the hope for more interdisciplinary work that we can come up with better solutions. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. We'll open for some questions. We'll take 1-2 questions. We have one question there on the table.
We actually practice, while we will not ask everybody to do everything, I think from a cloud angle, access authentication related controls, data residency or localization related controls, and I think encryption, audit logging related. These are the few examples of basic controls that is not very difficult to implement by design. Plus, if you can use the cloud provider given native component, for example, AWS given control tower, Azure has management groups, etc., etc. So, if you can use those native services to implement guardrails by design, so for example, any developer in my organization cannot spin up a virtual machine outside India, say for example. So I think you can use native services to implement guardrails. So these are the few ways in which I have seen the organizations were able to implement privacy by design.
I think we'll wrap up this panel, and of course, as you correctly pointed, this calls for a synergy between legal teams, technical people, so that, because this problem requires everyone to, all hands on deck and work together towards it. As you correctly said, pace should not go down. But of course, so lawyers also need to be involved from the very start of a product roadmap and not just towards the end for approvals. I think that was a very great session, and we'll close it for now. Thank you so much. One last? Okay.
On the privacy side, I mean, on the regulation side, you mentioned like data security is the responsibility of end organizations. So they implement controls like CASB or whatever, whichever controls. On the service provider side, like SaaS provider or ASPaaS providers like AWS or Azure, one regulation you mentioned, RBI is talking about, for banks it is data localization. Is there any regulations from Indian perspective to the vendors, whether it's SaaS vendors or ASPaaS vendors, except this data localization?
So I have not seen any separate regulations for them, right? It is common, and that's a good way to have, right? If you see, it's a very common, they call it omnibus regulation, right? It's applicable to everybody. That is what it is there. So scenario-based controls is what they need to deploy based on what service they are providing. Regulations-wise, I have not seen anything separately come up.
Yeah, maybe I can pitch into that. So I think I have been asked a similar question in the other discussion. You are in the bank, or what compliance you have separately. So practically for cloud, there is no separate compliance requirements. It's a part of the IT, right? So cloud is a different way in which IT is getting delivered, right? Instead of on-premise, the data is on the cloud. Only difference here is when you are applying on cloud, you are actually outsourcing a lot of things. So you need to bother about the control, compliance, and then even legal and data localization, data centralization, data retention, data deletion. All those things comes into play. So that is the, I mean, whole gamut of things. Yes, you are right. So the challenge here is, I think you should not, only one thing what we need to, we should not actually think about the tick in the box model for cloud. When you are going into the cloud, it's actually, you should have the design model itself, because cloud starts with the compliance control. You will not be able to log into AWS unless you have MFA. Yes or no? Because that is the design control, right? So security is already designed. So only thing is there are bypasses possible. Please don't do it. Yeah. Right. Yes. Agree. Absolutely. Absolutely agree. Yeah, we were part of that, by the way. Cloud Security Alliance Bangalore chapter was part of that. We are proud to be part of that. Anyway, thank you. With that, yes.
Just to add to that, like, though we don't have a common regulation for the suppliers, specifically the, cloud service providers, however, we do have the compliances, like, we have ISO 27018, which talks about, like, ensuring the protection of PII in cloud environment. Then we have several other, the standards around, like, we have CSS star, we have CAIQ level 2. Then we also have, like, the SOC 2 type 2 report covering the privacy trust service criteria. So when Krishna sir mentioned, like, the cloud service provider are attesting themselves to all of these standards and the compliances, a kind of a trust builds up over there. And just to answer your question, sir, around, like, ensuring to keep up with the pace of the innovation and all of those stuff, and adhering to the privacy requirements, like Krishna sir mentioned again, like, you need to be moving the privacy to the left in your entire cycle of the system development. So it's no more like DevSecOps, it is DevSec PrevOps. DevSec PrevOps. So like, to give you an example, there is no, more of the talk around like opt-out consent. Now it's going to be by default opt-in consent. You will require to explicitly provide the consent, which is going to be, provided to you freely. With your willingness, you will be going to opt in. Then we have the cookies management on the websites. Earlier, there were days where all the cookies were by default been enabled, and then you were not being given any choices. Now that is not that is no longer the case. It's only the strict cookies that are by default enabled, and you still get the option to reject the all other cookies that are optional. And then, like, the concepts around the security by default, like WhatsApp will provide you all the privacy related aspects by default, that no one else can add you to a particular group by default. Only if you allow them, only then they can add you to a particular group. So certain things are progressing, and those are evolving along with the technologies as well. Thank you.
Speakers, please remain. Thank you so much to speakers, and the kind of questions and queries and the thought process sharing that happens is evidently reflecting that we are in the right direction, either opening up the Pandora's box or trying to encapsulate a whole lot of ideas within the spectrum. Thank you so much, speakers, and with profound admiration for the effort and the time that you have spent with us, and your presence is like a blessing to us, I request Professor Avinash Dadich to present the mementos to one and each here. Thank you so much, sir. Now it's time for Ms. Satya to intervene for the quiz moments.
First question. Here it goes. Already raised. Half raised or full raised? Fully raised.
So it's data. I've read it. It's data confidentiality.
Data confidentiality, what is that? C. Yes or no? Everybody agree? See? Somebody said D. D, okay. Somebody said D, yes. Why D?
I think for cloud, data is very important because data is stored on the cloud, so you need a network to be connected to the cloud. If you don't have network, so I think that's very important.
Yes or no? Okay, why?
Question clearly mentions data privacy.
Okay, are we okay with the answer C? I don't know, yaar, tell me. Okay, excellent. So C, you get the answer. Your name, sir.
My name is Amit.
Amit. Okay. So it is data confidentiality. Yeah, network is needed to run the cloud, but it's about privacy. Okay, next one. It's a long question, is it? Because it's longest?
No, you can easily eliminate the rest of them. That is first part. And the second part is, strong encryption is the key. Having trust with the cloud service provider is definitely required. So that's the answer.
But why not data redundancy? It's needed, no?
Data redundancy is definitely needed, but you don't use it as a primary strategy for mitigating your privacy challenges.
Agree, everybody? Huh? Okay. Get it, bro. Name.
My name is Yogini.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank
Satya.
you.
And with no second thoughts, we can say that whether be data privacy or cloud computing, the issue should not come in between our right to food. So now it's the time for lunch break. Please do assemble back. Yeah. Okay.